Welcome everyone to another edition to As Above, So Below Radio. I'm your host, Martin Hodgson, and it gives me great pleasure to have you tuning in today. When you get a chance, please visit the newly revamped website holisticadvocate.com. For any updates on news as well as interviews, please visit my blog. Also take a moment to subscribe and become a member. Not only will you gain access to the commercial-free subscriber-based interviews, but also treat yourself to an assortment of fascinating people worth listening to. Today's guest is Barbara Lamb. Barbara is a licensed psychotherapist, a certified hypnotherapist, and a regression therapist in private practice in Claremont, California. Having regressed subjects since 1991, who have had encounters with extraterrestrials and interdimensional beings, she has also presented lectures and workshops throughout the United States, Canada, England, and Belgium, which have captivated audiences. She is also an acclaimed researcher into the crop circle phenomenon. Join me in welcoming Barbara as she discusses cases of close encounters with alien intelligence. First of all, Barbara, I want to extend to you a warm welcome for being on As Above, So Below Radio. Now,
thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, for any of the listeners out there, can you give us just a brief introduction, on your background and what got you started on your path towards being a hypnotherapist and a regressionist?
Okay. Well, it goes back quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1976, I was licensed as a marriage and family therapist and still continue that work, counseling with regular people with all kinds of issues. And then I noticed that I was doing some what I would call deeper work when it seemed to be called for. And I was realizing that I was actually doing some hypnosis work without labeling it that way, but people were pointing it out to me. And then in 1984, I met the people who had founded the International Association of Regression Research and Therapy, and I started taking training with them to do hypnotic regression therapy. And most of that work took us into past lives, which was extremely interesting, and I still do quite a bit of that work. But we learned regression techniques that could apply to really any situation. I took that training for about 5 years, and then I began to notice in 1991 that people were starting to come to me, people who had these very unusual encounters with what we call extraterrestrial beings. So since 1991, I've been doing a lot of this work. I never had imagined that it would develop so much, but it has. And since 1991, I have regressed it's probably 1,000 individuals now, specifically to experiences that they've had with extraterrestrial beings. And then some of those people have been able to come back from many regressions if they live within an hour or so of where I'm located in Southern California. And so I would say that it's at least 2,200 regressions to extraterrestrial experiences that I have conducted. So, and it still continues today, even this week. I regressed a couple of people to extraterrestrial experiences and also to experiences of where they came from, which kind of life form they were before this incarnation that they're in right now. There's more of that coming up these days. People want to know what their heritage is because they sense that they are not completely human. They certainly seem it, to their fellow people, but they sense that there's a difference. And sometimes that means that the difference is that they are from another species in the universe, another species that's very highly intelligent and is relating to some of our people nowadays from afar. In other words, in these extraterrestrial encounters. So it's been quite a ride, Martin, and you can imagine, and each and every regression that I've done of this type has been absolutely fascinating and informative. You know, I think that we've gotten a lot of material from all of this that is extremely interesting about these other life forms and what their purposes are in relating to human beings. And, it just goes on and on with fascination.
Yes, it sounds very interesting. Now, you touched upon the fact that some people are curious about their origin, that maybe they might feel out of place. I know that I've always felt that way, but when I look up at the stars, that I somehow belong out there. Have you
Oh,
ever
yeah.
touched? Yeah, I mean, have you ever touched upon the fact that, well, let me ask you this. You are familiar with the work of Dolores Cannon, right?
Oh, yes. In fact, she did a wonderful regression on me
Mm.
to an extraterrestrial experience I had.
Hmm.
Yeah, she is wonderful. She does very good, thorough work, and my goodness, she has brought through incredible information from these regressions that she's done.
Hmm. Well, the reason why I'm asking you this is because in one of her books, I believe maybe one or two of her books, she's mentioning the fact that there's three waves of volunteers coming here on Earth. And
Hmm.
I'm just curious that in your research, have you ever encountered these people who are coming in waves here? I think the first wave, these were the trailblazers, and I think the second wave, these were the energy transmitters or receivers. For the most part, these volunteers are helping to help raise the consciousness of the planet.
Yes. Well, it's so important that she's really making a point of that. And definitely, I do encounter that with many of these people,
Hmm.
some more than others, but they very often have a mission, and sometimes they're already aware of the mission before they come to me, and sometimes part of the work with me is that they discover what their mission is. And there are a lot of these people. I'm so very glad and grateful because I think the world needs that kind of upgrading. That is, humanity can use some upgrading in consciousness and upgrading in purpose, in my opinion. There are plenty of people who are here, I think, for service anyway. But I think that these particular people whom you're talking about do have heritage from another species out there in space, and they are more highly developed than we are in general, more highly conscious, and they do have a sense of mission, purpose. It's been said again and again in some of these regressions that these beings are looking at planet Earth and looking at humanity and wanting to help to upgrade it, bring us into higher consciousness for our own sake, and also so that we can eventually participate in the galactic community, which does exist out there. And so they do come and take these people for short episodes of an hour or two, and they're doing DNA work on them.
Hmm.
They're healing them if they need to. if the person needs healing, and they're teaching them and inspiring them, basically upgrading them. So this is all very important, Martin, because we hear a lot in the public media, the scary aspects of the extraterrestrial phenomenon. And there are lots of presentations about this that make it look like a nightmare and that these beings are up to no good and they're frightening. And people can experience it that way for sure. But once they begin to look into it further, in other words, have regressions that show them exactly moment by moment what happened in the encounter, then they begin to realize, this isn't really so frightening, and these beings aren't awful, and there's a purpose for what they're doing, even the things that I haven't liked, but it makes sense, and that puts a whole different light on it. I'd like to mention that I've had an experiencer support group monthly ever since 1994, and the group is still going strong today. And so we do a lot of sharing. These are all people who've had extraterrestrial encounters and have done regression work with me. So we know to some extent what they're dealing with here. And they all say that they began being aware of these experiences while feeling very frightened. And of course it's strange, it's unknown to us, and I can certainly understand their feeling about that. And then as they look into it more with the regressions, they see, this makes sense. There's a purpose for this, and there's a lot of good in it. Mm-hmm. So I feel that part of my purpose is to bring out that there is a lot of good in this phenomenon, as well as the stuff that people do not like so much. But the point is that the more that a person really knows what the experiences entail for them, the more the whole picture changes. And you realize that there are these very wise, intelligent beings of many different types who are looking at us, interacting with us for brief periods of time, and on the whole, I think they're trying to upgrade us.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, you've written, or actually co-written, 2 books called Crop Circles Revealed, Language of Light Symbols, and Alien Experiences, 25 Cases of Close Encounters Never Before Revealed. Now,
yes.
I had seen you conduct a workshop at the Conscious Life Expo in Los Angeles, which, by the way, you'll be attending once again to conduct another workshop. This next February in 2014. And in your presentation, you gave several examples of ET interaction with those who had been abducted. Now, one of the stories you told to the audience dealt with some of the ETs that had apologized to the subject and being told that the ETs, needed our DNA to help preserve their race because their race was atrophying. And I believe one example you had cited was an insectoid-looking ET, correct?
Mm-hmm. A mantis being.
A mantis being. Would you like to share this story with the listening audience?
Well, could you give me a little clue? I've had so many, 2,200 regressions that at the moment I just need a little bit more guidance as to which experience.
Well, the one that I recollect was it was an insectoid-looking species and the ET had told to the abductee, you know what, we apologize for what we're doing to you. Could we have your permission to take some specimens from your body?
Mm-hmm.
And the abductee, of course, was reluctant and obviously fearful of the situation, but eventually, I believe it was a she. She permitted this to happen, um, but maybe you may not recall, with your extensive research and notes and so forth, but this was a presentation you gave back maybe 2 years ago at the LAX Hilton, and that vividly stood out in my mind because,
Well, I think that you're talking about the situation. It was actually a woman from Holland
okay,
whom I regressed when we were both in England.
hmm
And I had not met her before that, didn't know her, but she had said when we met out in the fields in the crop circle, we started talking, and she said, I hear that you do this regression work for people who've had extraterrestrial encounters, and I've had them, and I would very much appreciate a regression.
hmm
So in the regression, the main feature was that she was on a medical type table on a spacecraft, or it certainly seemed to be in that sort of a craft. It was sort of a round room and very bright lighting. And there she was lying on the medical table. And the one being who was there looked like a very huge beetle sort of creature. He had a big hard, it was a male, she felt, a male being. He had a very hard shell that was probably about 5 or 6 feet long on his back, and an insect-like head. And the most striking feature about him was that he had a long pincer-like protuberance, like a nose. It was rather like a needle, and like one of our injection needles, but it was actually part of his body. And he was piercing her body here and there, and then seeming to draw out blood through that pincer. And, of course, she was wondering what it was. It felt like pinpricks. Of course, that's something that she definitely noticed. It wasn't horribly painful, but certainly wasn't comfortable. And after a while, she asked him, what he was doing. I mean, why was he doing that? And he gave her an answer. And this is quite typical in regressions, that if the person being regressed is asking the being, why are you doing this? They almost always get an answer which comes to them telepathically. The thoughts are sort of transmitted into their minds. They don't hear a voice. They don't talk the way that we do, but they definitely talk with their thought. And this being said to her, our species is needing a certain component that you humans have in your blood. And without that component in our species, we will not continue to survive. And we have other components, too, that you humans don't have. But we do need this one ingredient that you have, that all of you humans have in your blood. So I am taking as much as I need, and I will take it back to my kind, and then we will inject each other with this blood component and actually be able to continue to survive. So once she realized that, she believed him, and once she realized that that's why he was pricking her body and drawing out blood, in all kinds of places of her body, all over, she relaxed into it and realized that this was a very intelligent being, and he came from a whole different species, and that if she could help them to survive, even if she would never know them, she, was in favor of the idea. She agreed. So sometimes these people who have these experiences and maybe are experimented on in some ways, they don't realize it consciously, but they had formerly agreed to cooperating with a different species. And when they did that agreement, it was in what we would call the soul state of being. In other words, before this lifetime. And we are all, I'm convinced of it now, we are all ongoing, continuing souls. And then before we go into each lifetime, we do kind of a review, sort of a gathering of our thoughts, probably even in most cases communicating with other souls about the lifetime that we're going to go into. And we make certain agreements. Yes, I'll explore this theme, or I'll work on that issue, or I'll get to experience such and such kind of thing. And I'll deciding where I'm going to be born and who my family is, and the major things I'm going to be experiencing and having the opportunity to work on. I think, parenthetically, that we all do this before coming into a lifetime. And so these people, in doing that sort of planning stage before the lifetime, they have been visited by extraterrestrial beings in spirit, and the beings have asked if the person would cooperate with them when in the lifetime as a human being. And these people have agreed. So they've forgotten that in the living of the life, just like most of us have forgotten the agreements that we made before coming into this lifetime. And many people don't even understand that concept at all, but I think it's nevertheless true. And so when the person realizes that they've already made an agreement and they've relived that in a regression, so it seems very real and very detailed to them, that puts a whole different light on being abducted and having these things done to them. So I think it's very helpful to have that perspective. And most people probably don't have that perspective. I learned it only by doing this work. So I think that's a very significant aspect of this, that people who are having these extraterrestrial encounters have already agreed to it. Now, they don't remember having agreed to it, just like they don't remember all the other reasons why they agreed to come into this lifetime, or at least most people don't remember that. But it's all there. That's the wonderful thing. From my point of view, it's all there for us to know. It's all there in our subconscious mind and in our higher knowing, or we could call it our soul knowing, that all of this information is available. So that's why we can learn a lot, and that's why people can be really helped with this by doing these regressions when they want to. People always ask me for regressions. I don't just have somebody come in and regress them. It's definitely something that they want to do and ask to do, which means that they're open to finding out these things that have happened to them, these perspectives that they didn't consciously know about.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned that because, with the story that I recalled, there was consent there on behalf of the abductee, because I've heard so many cases where people were traumatized of the abduction experience, and I mean, books have been written, movies have been produced, and so forth. And that seems to be the emphasis now, that there's fear and fright associated with these abductions or encounters, if you want to use that term.
Mm-hmm.
But you pretty much underscored the reality in that we do make a contract, so to speak, in the spirit world with these alien beings that we forget when we incarnate.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, and there's another thing, too, that some people come more specifically for the answering the question, why me? You know, why am I having these encounters with these unusual beings? Then they might think, well, other people I know don't have them, but, you know, again, why me? I certainly can understand they're wondering that. And sometimes when we go back to, in the regression, to the source of their having these experiences, sometimes, as I was suggesting, they go back to that soul state of being and realize that they had agreed to this. And some other people in that type of regression go back to actually having been one of those species of beings in a previous lifetime, or probably many previous lifetimes. And as that other being in the most recent other lifetime, previous lifetime, they have agreed with that species, being one of them, to, in the next lifetime, which is this one that they're in, they have agreed to be a volunteer and to come here to planet Earth as a human being, be born here from regular human parents, and grow up as a human in order to have that experience of being a human, which is quite different than being whatever species they originally came from. And by being a human, it would help their beings to know more about humans. There are a lot of species of beings out there in the cosmos who are very, very interested in planet Earth. They're interested in the Earth itself and interested in the billions of life forms that we have. It was said by one of the extraterrestrial beings that planet Earth has more species of many different kinds than all of the other planets that have life put together. That we're just a maelstrom, a seething planet full of species. And it's remarkable, they think, how well, basically, these species get along together, even though they feed upon each other. But they see that there's an order to it. And then, of course, they're very interested in human beings because many of those species have contributed to our DNA over millennia of time. And so there's a part of them in us, and they're very, very interested in us and how we're developing, how we're constituted, what we're basically doing, what our consciousness is. And so that's one of the reasons given by these beings for so many of them visiting us and studying us, observing us, getting to know us through these encounters, which we call abductions. So I think it's really great to sort of broaden the perspective here that there's a lot going on in the universe and that we are of great interest. It's not that, at least I don't see it, that there are all these quote-unquote evil beings coming here and doing mean things to humans. it's easy to have that perspective, I agree, but it's so much broader than that. And so, in a sense, we could say that we all, every single one of us humans, we are children of the universe. And that means that we have a lot of the genetics of many, many different non-human species in us.
Mm-hmm.
And so these beings are very interested in us.
Mm-hmm.
So don't you think that kind of puts a different perspective on the whole thing?
Yes, matter of fact, what I'm curious about here is our DNA. I mean, what is so special about our DNA? I mean, to be honest, we are, I guess you would say, a fragile species, and to be honest, we're, bombarded almost 24/7 with poisons all around us from
Yes.
smog, chemtrails, additives, and preservatives found in our food,
Oh,
hormones, the junk
oh, yes.
food we consume, the
Hmm.
mercury that's added to the vaccines, and I can go on and on with a huge laundry list. So,
Oh, I could too.
yeah,
It's appalling,
yeah.
absolutely appalling.
So, wouldn't all these chemicals, in effect, label us as untouchables to the ETs? I mean, wouldn't all these chemicals pollute our bodies?
Well, yes, I'm sure they are polluting our bodies, and there are researchers who are bringing this out more and more. And that, too, has been given as a reason from some of these extraterrestrials during the encounters that they're checking up on us, particularly when they do the physical exams of people, which so frequently they do in an encounter. And that is to test and check, or at least from some of these beings, those examinations are to check and see how we are doing with all these pollutants, with all these challenges to our bodies. So if they take a blood sample or even skin sample or any kind of fluid from our bodies, that's not just to be mean to us. That is so that they can actually analyze and study those materials from us and to see how we are coping with all these pollutants as you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reason for it. And what they do with that material, I don't know, but it may have something to do also with the cattle mutilations and the other mutilations of animals that we hear about, that really do happen for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And we've wondered for many years, why is that happening? And is it happening from extraterrestrials? Well, it seems like that's a good assumption because there have been some witness cases where someone has seen a UFO and a big beam of light coming down into a field and lifting up a cow or some other large animal. Sometimes it's as big as a horse, and then later appearing and dropping down the animal, having already taken out a lot of the vital organs of the animal. And it's been said by some of these beings that they're studying to see, how these animals are doing with all the pollutants. Excuse
Well,
me, I got a
sure,
sneeze.
sure.
So that, you see, I think that there's a lot of that research going on the part of these beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, what really amazes me is that you mentioned cattle mutilations, and there's another component to this story because if you're familiar with the research done by Linda Moulton Howe, she's
Yes.
done extensive research and reporting on cattle mutilations.
She
But
certainly.
yeah, but what she's also researched on is that there have been human mutilations where, let's say, humans have been abducted and they've been mutilated, um, and you never hear about this component in the media. And I'm
Mm.
wondering if, in fact, they, in this case, the ETs, have touched upon this or hinted upon this with you.
Well, one of the difficulties we're dealing with here
Hmm.
is that people who are taken and mutilated
Hmm.
don't come back.
Right.
And, obviously, unfortunately. And so therefore, I don't, or anybody doesn't, have the opportunity to regress them and try to find out more about this. Like, what is the motivation
Hmm.
on the part of those beings? So I just really can't say anything about that. I've
Hmm.
heard of it, but I haven't personally run into it because,
Hmm.
as they say, those people are not returned from those abductions, so we just don't get that point of view.
Hmm.
I,
Okay.
I think that compared to the whole phenomenon of a lot of different types of extraterrestrial beings coming here briefly and doing these encounters with humans, I think that proportionately, as far as I can tell, the human mutilation part of it is a very small proportion.
Hmm.
But then I don't think anybody on Earth knows. There's nobody who has the whole picture. It's just that those of us working in this field and actually doing research as we're doing this work, we have our own perspective of it, our own picture by what comes through to us. Like, for instance, Jim Sparks, who's a well-known abductee, he went through many experiences and remembered a remarkable amount of them and wrote the book, The Keepers. Now, his experience with those particular beings was different than some other people whom I know and work with, very different from their experiences
Hmm.
with extraterrestrial beings. I think it's safe to conclude that there are many, many different types of beings who do come to Earth, or many more who have nothing to do with Earth, I'm sure, in this great, fantastic cosmos that we all live in. But there are many different types who come to Earth, and they seem to have different agendas. So,
Interesting.
and that's one of the really fascinating things to me in doing this work, that, in 1991, the beings who came to the first person I did several regressions on, which got me going in this aspect of my work. Those beings seem to be focused on physical aspects of this young woman experiencer. And then when I had my next person come, and she worked with me for 11 years, and we had, I would say at least 60 regressions and lots of discussions about it all. Anyway, she had, even just this one person, had, probably, I would say 20 different kinds of beings who came to her on different occasions and had a whole different agenda. So it ranged in this one person from the beings who did lots of medical checks up on her and put in implants and tested her different physical systems and did mind scans. They were, where a being looks directly into the person's eyes and seems to draw out information from the person or see the whole life history of the person. That's what it seems like to the person. And also sometimes the beings will look directly into the eyes of the person and seem to be giving information telepathically, like downloading information into the person's brain. So those two processes happen sometimes. But that's all kind of like on the physical medical table type of experience. And then there are a lot of procedures done that create hybrid babies, hybrid beings that males and females participate in. And we can get into that later if you'd like to, but I want to continue with this point. So many people experience that sort of thing, being on the medical table, and a whole variety of things happening there, including the person sometimes being physically healed of a really challenging condition that the person might have. I've known of many cases of that. And this is quite spectacular and, of course, very, very helpful to the person. So that's one type of thing, these physical-oriented experiences. And then the same person, like this person I mentioned I worked with for 11 years, on other occasions, when she's taken for the encounter, she meets with very different kinds of experiences. And some of them are educating her and stimulating her mind and broadening her perspective, actually teaching her things, including, in her case and many other cases, teaching her physical skills of healing so that she can heal, do energetic healing with other humans or with animals or whomever she chooses here on Earth. And many times they're taught about the cosmos and the universe and different dimensions of reality. With some people, they have a hugely spiritual experience with these beings and are taken to places like beautiful crystalline city of lights way out in space, usually taken by just one being. And in that city of lights, they meet with these lovely, radiant beings who are, we would probably consider more spiritual or other dimensional than we humans are. But they're glowing and unconditionally loving and absolutely wonderful to be with. So a lot of people, on some occasions, even though they're having physical procedures on other occasions, but on some of these occasions, they're having the most enlightening, imaginable spiritual experiences with some of these beings. So there's a tremendous range of what's happening here. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so fascinating to me, just seeing the extreme differences of beings and extreme differences of experiences that humans have with these beings, some of which are just absolutely glorious. In fact, there are some people who have had one of these highly spiritual experiences with some of these beings, and they feel terribly sad when they're returned to Earth. I remember one woman years ago whom I worked with, and she worked for a bank, regular person, regular job, and then she was having these extremely enlightening spiritual experiences out in space with some of these beings, and she felt unconditionally loved each time. And even though she had grown up knowing some love, through her family and marriage and so forth, that couldn't compare with the unconditional radiant love that she experienced out there with some of these beings. So I just remember one regression we did, and she was just almost desolately sad to be returned to Earth and to go back to her bank job, where people were normal people doing their work, perfectly decent, but not radiating that unconditional love. She thought, wow, humanity is way behind the curve here, because we don't do that. We don't go around, unconditionally loving each other. But some of those societies of beings truly do that. That's a regular way of life.
Well, it's interesting.
If we could be like that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you cited that story, because it almost sounds like a near-death experience where the experiencer, is in a different environment entirely. They are be unconditionally loved in a loving environment, and they're told, well, it's not yet your time. We've just given you just a teaspoonful of what it's like to be in the spirit world, but you need to, fulfill your mission, and it's time that you go back. And when they do resuscitate the person, there's this depression the person experiences because they were in a loving environment.
Oh, you're so right. I'm glad you're bringing that up. And that's so similar, you see, to what what some of these people are experiencing with these beings. And so it certainly seems as if when they're having these high spiritual experiences, that perhaps they are actually taken into another dimension of reality. Now, one of the things that I just keep learning again and again with many of these people is that there are, I'm totally convinced now, there are many dimensions of reality. And the higher the dimension goes, or that means, I think, the more rapid the vibration of that domain and those beings, the more conscious they are and the more loving they are. So I've gotten the perspective over time that we, human beings living in human bodies here on planet Earth, in this third dimension, 3D as we call it, that we are a slower vibration, and many people describe it as a heavier vibration. Now, it's what we're used to. It seems absolutely normal to us. I know it does to me. But sometimes when people in this heavier, slower dimension develop the pattern of meditation or certain spiritual practices, they describe feeling much more lightweight, that is, and sort of a faster vibration. Everything's clearer, everything's finer, everything's more peaceful. We do have the opportunity to know people like that, regular people who do a lot of meditating, and they really seem to be clearer somehow, clearer, lighter, more refined, and yet they're still living in a human body. So if we enlarge upon that idea and think of, there are many, many different intelligences and beings in existence, who don't even have a physical body. Maybe they have a light body, or maybe they're just pure light and consciousness. That's vibrating at a very different rate, and that seems to come with it the ability to be unconditionally loving, loving, open, sharing. So I think it's just fantastic that certain humans in their extraterrestrial encounters are taken for a while, maybe half hour or so, to experience that sort of thing. And then they come back to their dense 3D body and go on with their regular life. And of course, there's a tremendous contrast to that and a great sense of disappointment. There were two men whom I regressed. This was a few years ago, and they didn't know each other. They were from totally different locations. But in each case, the man was taken by an extraterrestrial out into space, and not even in a craft, just sort of taken out, and they could see ahead of them in space a huge living being that looked like an amoeba-shaped being. In other words, it sort of undulated in and out at the edges and seemed to be sort of flowing in the universe. And in both cases, the amoeba-looking being was semi-transparent, and they could look into it. And in both cases, this being was of beautiful colors, sort of pinks and purples and lavenders and whites and sort of a mixture of colors in different areas, sort of flowing into each other. Absolutely beautiful. They said it was sort of like looking at a jellyfish. You know, one of those really beautiful jellyfishes you see in aquariums sometimes, and they're beautiful colors, and they undulate and they flow and they sort of pulse in and out a bit, and you can see partially into them. Well, that's how they described this huge amoeba being. And they were actually taken by the being into the inside of that being. And at first they thought, oh, what am I getting into?
Right.
I don't know about this. But then once they were inside, they realized that they had clairsentience. They knew everything about everything. And they felt complete unconditional love. They felt it within themselves, and they felt it coming to them, this unconditional love. And they had a wonderful time inside that being. And then, eventually, the being brought them out again of that amoeba-like being and returned them to Earth. And now waking up from or coming out of that kind of experience, you can imagine the contrast of feelings being back here on Earth with regular life going on. And one man in the regression to that experience, he actually, while doing the regression, had a great stream of tears running down his cheek, both cheeks. They were tears of happiness and being enthralled while he was in that being. And then, as he was being returned to Earth and found himself back in his bed in his room on Earth, then they were tears of great sadness. You know, what a contrast, having had that kind of enlightening experience and then being back here in humdrum life. So this sort of thing really does happen to some people, probably to more people than we know. And there was a third man, interesting that they just happened to be men, but that's how it goes. You know, I just work with the people who find me and work with me. Anyway, the third man had been terribly frightened about the encounters he was having with these strange little beings, and they started in his childhood. And understandably, he didn't like it when they would come into his room at night. He didn't understand it. His parents thought he was just having nightmares and, didn't really address it with him, didn't help him with it. And he had a brother who shared the same bed. And when these little beings would come, they would only take this man and not pay any attention to his brother. This, by the way, is very typical, that they take just one person and leave the other person deeply sleeping or switched off out of awareness and temporarily. So the little boy developed a habit of sleeping under his bed, which had a big wooden frame, and to be hidden in case these beings should come, he would sleep on the floor between the head of the bed, the big bedstead wooden, and the wall. And there's not very much room in there, but he'd try to squeeze in there as best as he could so that if the little beings came, they wouldn't find him. Well, as it happened, they did always find him anyway, but because they know these things. But anyway, he was one of the people who was taken to this large amoeba-like being. And, oh boy, what a different perspective he had of the whole thing after he had that regression, because that was such an incredibly loving, wonderful experience that it helped him to realize that these little beings, little gray beings, who were taking him now and then, were taking him sometimes at least to these exquisitely wonderful experiences. Mm-hmm. So then he began, of course it didn't happen, he didn't know about this until well into his adult life, his middle years, but then it began to change his whole perspective about the little beings and about any beings that were coming to him and taking him away in the night. So you see, Martin, the more we know about this phenomenon, in my opinion, the better perspective people have on it, that it's not all bad, it's not all scary. Mm-hmm. Sometimes these encounters are absolutely wonderful.
Well, it all sounds very fascinating, Barbara. Now, we are approaching the end of the first hour, and I know that you have two websites. Let's see, you have your regular website, which is Barbara Lamb, Lamb, like in boy, mft.com. Is that correct?
Yes, Barbara Lamb, mft.com. That is my website. And then I think you were referring to another one where I can be found.
Yes.
www.womeninufology. And that's a very interesting site because it not only mentions a bit about my work, mm-hmm. but it also talks about some other women who are very engaged in researching this extraterrestrial phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the website was put up by a woman who thought, a lot of these UFO conferences are absolutely wonderful, but there are very few women who are speakers in these conferences. Mm-hmm. And we women who are really doing very fine work in this field, we should be speakers too. And actually, I have been a speaker myself in many, many conferences, starting in about 1992. But a lot of these women are doing great work, and they never do get invited to be speakers at these big conferences. So we just wanted us to be known about that we, too, can really contribute in this field of very important investigation. So that's why somebody took the initiative to put up the website. But I think your listeners would find it quite interesting to know what some of us are working on in this regard.
Oh, yeah, and definitely. And also, just to let the audience know, you will be speaking at the Los Angeles Conscious Life Expo in February of 2014. And what we discussed here was just a morsel as to what you'll be discussing in your workshop
Yes.
in 2014. Anybody
Oh,
who's interested, by any chance, who wants to go to their webpage, which is consciouslifeexpo.com, can get a perspective as to what you'll be covering in your workshop. I believe I'm looking at the title here. It's Extraterrestrial Beings, Significant Encounters. And this is Friday, February 7th, between 6 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Again, this is at the Los Angeles Conscious Life Expo. Anybody who is interested I would recommend you go to this website and register to listen to your fascinating lecture on your research on the extraterrestrials.
So
Now,
also, Martin, I'd like to just add that there will be visuals too. I will give a PowerPoint presentation of many of the different types of beings that we know about. They've all come through my regression work, and it will show a really large range of beings. A few photographs, we believe they're real photographs, of extraterrestrial beings, and mostly excellent artists' depictions of beings as described in great detail by the people who experience these beings. So you get the visual and the information, and people have reported in the past that they found it very fascinating, so I hope they will this time too.
that helps a lot when you have visuals because you get to
Yes.
see how these beings actually look like from an artist's point of view. Now, Barbara, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make for the audience here?
Well, thank you. That's a nice opportunity. Well, I think that there is a significant phenomenon occurring, whether people are aware of it or not. It's a worldwide phenomenon of many people, millions of people, in fact, being visited by what we call extraterrestrial beings and interdimensional beings. And the cosmos is full of life, whether our astronomers have discovered that yet or not. The phenomenon goes on. We are visited. It is true, and I think it's significant enough for us to know about. So I'm very happy to share what I can about it.
Oh, great. Okay, well, I appreciate you taking the time here to chat with me for the first hour, and I'll see you again for the second hour, Barbara.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Barbara. Take care, and I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Okay, take care then.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's it for the first hour on As Above, So Below Radio. Tune in for the second hour by subscribing to holisticadvocate.com, where Barbara will further speculate on crop circles and their mysterious origins, the involvement of design with these circles. Is there a hidden language? The connection to crop circles and ley lines, and Barbara's benevolent encounter with the reptilian, and much more. You're listening to As Above, So Below Radio.